one thing I want to talk about, and I want all the panel members to chime in, is that in the community where we do the show, we're in Island Park tonight, but we cover, the Long Beach, Oceanside, Island Park area here on the South Shore. And this week, we had the highest profile death of an overdose in the history of Long Beach, when the rising popular rapper Lil Peep died of a drug overdose at 21 years of age. And I'd like Rocco to further expand. Rich, if you could take the camera and talk about Lil Peep, and then I want the experts to chime in because of the fact of his journey dealing with a lot of these issues was in his music. So Rocco, I know you followed this very closely.
Yes.
Why don't you expand on Lil Peep?
Yes, Lil Peep was born Gustav R, and he was raised right here in Long Beach, went to Long Beach High, and he had dropped out, pursued his GED, and tried to get a career in the music industry. So he moved to Los Angeles, and he relied on a lot of the stuff he had been going through. He had been suffering from depression and suicidal thoughts, and he was battling drug addictions of various kinds, including to ones like cocaine and ecstasy, and he was trying to basically use his music to treat himself, basically. He had put out a couple of, in hip-hop, what is known as a mixtape, basically like trial records, and it set up, he got word of mouth, and he had a big cult following on Instagram, and there were a lot of people. He was so blunt, and he was so honest about what he had went through in his life that so many of his fans felt like a very intense personal connection to him and his music. So basically, it just kept snowballing into, getting bigger and bigger. There were a lot of people in the music industry that were very, very, big fans and supportive of his music. And he had just put out his first album, like literally only 2 months before this happened. And the really sad thing about this particular situation with him is that in many ways, the accolades he had gotten comparisons to Kurt Cobain. Kurt Cobain, as you know, was in Nirvana. He had struggled with drug problems himself. He ended up killing himself right at the height, right when Nirvana was still at the height of their popularity, pretty much. So this is kind of like a very, very similar scenario, although it's a bit more of like a cult scenario. It's online mainly, but from what everybody has said in the music industry from him, and he was on the verge of becoming fairly big in hip hop. There were a lot of rappers, like big rappers at the time, like people have had top 10 hits that have mentioned him and, said that they felt that he was going to contribute a lot to the art form. And it really hits home. Like you listen to a lot of the music he did, it's very, very personal. He uses a lot of rock music as kind of a background for his sound. And basically he talks about, he uses it as like a confessional, basically, to talk about his problems with drugs and with suicidal thoughts. And the way he carried himself publicly, you got a sense that this was just a tragedy waiting to happen. Literally hours before he died, he basically said, that, when I die, you're gonna love me. And all the signs were there. Like he would be openly taking drugs in photos and in videos on Instagram, and he was very, very blunt about just what kind of path he was on. And there was a lot of his fans on Instagram and who listened to his music that really felt a connection to him, like Kurt Cobain, through their own hopelessness. And they realized that it just further confirmation of how really messed up it is for a lot of people.
Shelley, you want to expand on that?
Yes, I just want to say two things, and I really always appreciate, Rocco, your incisive comment. What I'd like to say is, we always talk about the drug history, the drug culture, and after, 30 years in social work, I can tell you very few people go from, just go into drug addiction without, like, let's say, a diagnosis of something else beforehand. And I have also heard that this young man had suffered from depression from the time he was like 6 or 7. And the tragedy to me is that so many of our young people are self-medicating. This young man was out there saying, I'm suicidal, and yet, in our culture, you can say I have cancer. My mom had cancer. Boom, she's at Sloan Kettering. Within 2 weeks she had, an 18-hour surgery, probably cost $500,000, and she's out there golfing now. This is not even a year later, but yet, young people are saying I'm depressed. They're saying I'm suicidal, and then we say we have a drug crisis. Well, what we really have is a mental health crisis that is not being addressed, no matter how vehement these youngsters are trying to express their pain, their suffering, even that they feel so connected to somebody like that.
Mm-hmm.
I feel connected to the song Imagine, by John Lennon.
Yes.
Thank God, but these youngsters, really hook into this. Why do we, why are they're self-medicating? Why are we not getting them treatment? Why is it so easy to get cancer treatment, kidney treatment, heart replacements? Why? And why is it so easy to scream to, Robin Williams? You'd think that would have an impact, but nobody wants to deal with the stigma of mental illness. They don't want to be different. I'm different, I'll tell you right now. I'm different, I'm weird, I'm wacky. They used to call me Wacky Jackie when I was a kid, and I hated it. But, I was also the president of my class, and I had a history of depression. And like the heart disease, my son's paternal grandfather jumped off a bridge. Now, I went to every single doctor, the best doctors with what we call in social work a genogram. I told them, my son has a grandfather who was suicidal, a grandmother who's agoraphobic, alcoholism, and yet they just looked at me like, really? I'm like, you asked me about the BRCA gene. I don't have that. But, people will take out off your breast, they'll walk 38 miles for, a less lethal disease, but what are we doing about, suicidality, mental health, and care? Like, you matter. I'm cheering for you because it's people don't want to talk about it in schools. They don't want to talk about it. If I say, people see me in the supermarket still, 22 months after my son passed away, and they run the other way. All you have to say is,
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, Jackie. But I wanted to share that. Like, what's wrong with our culture that, you can get cancer at 80 years old and have $500,000 worth of treatment, but you can't get into rehab or mental health, and that these kids who are using are just, I believe that they are self-medicating, and they get addicted, and then they have another whole layer. So it's not just drugs. Why are these fatalistic people like Kurt Cobain so idolized?
Absolutely. And Stephen, I know Stephen wants to share on this topic as well. Steve?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to kind of mirror many of the things that Jackie said. I think a lot of times these drug overdoses that we're seeing, the line between whether or not it's a drug overdose or it's a suicide is really ambiguous. Whether the person espoused that they intended to kill themselves when they took these large doses. And so I would agree that I think that we have a much larger mental health crisis that's happening. I also want to kind of draw attention to a lot of these drugs started off as prescribed drugs as well. And there's a lot of, just to get a little more kind of advocacy and activism in the conversation as well, there's a lot of laws that are being pushed on a federal level to make it easier for these drugs to actually get out into the public and to get into the hands of folks who are going to use them to self-medicate. And so there's a lot of work to be done as far as to on the political landscape to clinch off the availability of these drugs. But on a more base level, we need to make the conversation around mental health more out there in the open. And I think it's great that so many folks on the panel have spoken about their own experiences. And I think it really starts there is saying to folks that I've gone through things that I've thought, hey, maybe a drug would be better than having to deal with this every day, and really engaging with people's empathy and recognizing that there's a lot of vilifying that goes on, not only within the hip hop industry, but also within drug users. Drug users are people too. They're human beings that are struggling with something, and if any one of us were given these drugs, I had one gentleman who spoke at Suffolk said that the high that he had from heroin was the greatest experience he ever had in his life, but the price of that was not worth it. And so, like anybody exposed to these things could be in the same place as Little Peep or any other human being who becomes addicted. And so, again, humanizing the conversation and recognizing that these are people's children, these are brothers, these are fathers, these are sons, and just like all of us. And so, rather than labeling a person, well, they're in the place that they are because of them, stepping back and recognizing not only the social construct that they're stuck in, and the very human struggles that every single one of us go through, and just engaging with the person from there.
Absolutely. We're going to take a little break, and we have so much more to talk about. I think this is a very constructive opening, but we have so many more topics to talk about, and folks, all aspects of mental health are going to be discussed with this amazing panel, and please share these videos, because by sharing videos, you might help people. They can be on our Halftime Howie show page on Facebook, our Halftime Howie YouTube channel. You're getting great advice, great input, and we're going to touch on all aspects of mental health during the show tonight.